Hello, I am the real-life fake wizard. On a recent podcast episode of Thought Crime, Jack Posobiec and other members of the Turning Point USA activist team made the passing claim that J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings mythos is an overtly pagan story and shares no Christian values. It is not often that I do video responses. It's not my thing. I don't like doing them. This would be the third video response I've ever done on this channel, and that's only because this claim that Professor Tolkien's work is pagan and has no connection to Christianity is firstly provably false, as we'll discuss in a moment, but also is such a polarizing and dangerous sentiment that it should not go unanswered for. Funny enough, there are 3 people I've made video responses to. 2 of them happen to be part of the new Access Media team that went on the Epstein Binder tour. Ain't that something? My friends, we are living through a period where storytelling itself has become a battlefield. The stories that shaped Western culture are under sustained assault from multiple directions. We talk often about how Hollywood studios acquire beloved properties and then reinvent them to fit new norms and narratives. Across the entire entertainment industry, not even just Hollywood here, corporate executives, marketers, content creators, journalists, and the writers are all participating in systematically changing the way that we perceive not just heroes and hero figures, but storytelling as a medium of human expression. These 5 types of people participate in this alteration of legacy for motivations that stem from commercial, political, and/or personal gain. Sometimes it's all 3. Jack Posobiec and the TPUSA panelists who agreed with his assertion that Tolkien's stories are overtly pagan are engaging in the exact same strategy as I just described with Hollywood, seeking some kind of commercial, political, and/or personal gain, but they're attacking this from a different position on our metaphorical chessboard, which seems to be ironic considering TPUSA's own track record. The organization built a significant portion of its cultural credibility on criticizing Hollywood for hijacking legacy franchises. Charlie Kirk himself spoke frequently about the importance of defending stories like this and holding their stewards accountable, even being on the record himself defending Lord of the Rings as being, quote, one of the greatest artistic accomplishments of the species. If we zoom out here, a legacy work of fiction is being reframed to serve a commentator's ideological projection. The source material and the author's intent are being misrepresented. The audience is seemingly being told to abandon a story that shaped how they perceive morals like heroism, bravery, and right from wrong, and it's not because the story changed at all, because it hasn't. No, someone with a platform has decided it serves a purpose to attempt to redefine what the story means. Swap the political alignment back and forth here, and this is the same rhetoric from Hollywood and the gaming industry. The stories need to be abandoned for failure to appeal to a specific audience. In both cases, this is, and always has been, a lie. Whether it be in chess or negotiation or even Mario Kart, right? The goal is to get in your opponent's head to understand how they think and why they think the way that they do, you know? Well, if I'm to try and empathize with the position that Jack Posobiec is taking here, none of it reflects well for him. I cannot fathom being in his position and thinking this works out positively for him in any long-term way. But let's try playing this out. The first position is that Posobiec genuinely believes that The Lord of the Rings is truly overtly pagan, which means he is either not educated on Tolkien's background and inspiration for these stories, and/or worse, he doesn't care. I think it's a combination of both personally based on his incessant arguing with people on Twitter. This points us towards a position where if these men are as immovable on something as fictional as kings and wizards fighting the forces of pure evil, I have to believe they're as immovable on real-world issues too. And being that you are political activists, now we're going to a place where you might be dangerous. We'll explore that more in a little bit. Regardless, taking such a strong position like this without being fully educated or refusing to be educated is irresponsible for anyone with a platform of this size, and TPUSA's audience deserves better than to have their relationship with a foundational morality-focused story as impactful as Lord of the Rings disrupted by someone who did not do the reading. The second position possibility is that he knows his claims are reductive and misleading and is making them anyway, because this generates engagement. It feeds the pagan threat narrative that TPUSA Faith has been building with Lucas Miles's book. Or, since controversy is the currency of the attention economy and Tolkien is a large enough target to generate it, perhaps this is a no press is bad press situation. In that case, he is doing exactly what TPUSA accuses Hollywood of doing, weaponizing a beloved story for leverage and treating the audience's emotional connection to that story as a resource to be exploited rather than something that should be respected. Well, in any case, we should refute these claims, and for our first rebuttal, it comes from Professor Tolkien himself. In 1953, writing privately to Father Robert Murray, a priest and close friend of his, Tolkien described The Lord of the Rings in unambiguous terms. Quote, "The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision." He went on to explain that he had deliberately removed overt references to religion because, quote, "the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism." This was a private letter to a priest who was also his friend. The professor wasn't appealing to customers or social media audiences. We can take his statements as truth because he was speaking to a man he trusted spiritually. Tolkien was a man who attributed everything he knew to his Catholic faith, which he received from his mother, Mabel Tolkien. She converted to Catholicism in 1900. Her family disowned her for it. The resulting poverty contributed to her early death. Tolkien, 8 years old at the time, was raised from that point forward by a Catholic priest, Father Francis Morgan. The faith that produced The Lord of the Rings was purchased at the highest personal cost a family can pay. To declare this man's life's work as overtly pagan requires you to override his own explicit, documented, and repeated testimony with your own surface-level analysis. This is a remarkable show of confidence for someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. It is at this point in our discussion where it might make sense for us to go deeper into the hyper-specific lore inspirations, right? Or perhaps discuss how Tolkien was part of the driving force for converting C.S. Lewis into a born-again Christian, who went on to create Narnia. Or perhaps that there are nearly 100 distinct works published by authors discussing and extrapolating the dimensions of Christianity found in Tolkien's life and his stories. We should talk about how there is a god in Middle-earth named Eru Iluvatar, and it's supposed to be a representation of the Christian god, like this is God. Sauron is a depiction of Satan. Morgoth is a depiction of Satan. The Astari are actually all depictions of angels. Gandalf literally sacrifices himself to battle death and is resurrected as a means of symbolizing the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Lembas bread is a representation of the Eucharist. Frodo's burden of bearing the ring across Middle-earth to save the world is symbolic of Christ carrying the cross to save humanity. Aragorn, this is a good one, is the rightful king who lives in exile, unrecognized, walking amongst the people he was born to rule, just as Christ was born in a stable and raised as a carpenter. His kinship is established through an unbroken ancestral line and foretold by prophecy, mirroring the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. His broken sword is reforged when the time comes to claim his throne, signaling the restoration of what was shattered by the failures of his ancestors. The way Christ's coming restored what was broken by the fall. He walks the paths of the dead and liberates souls trapped by an unfulfilled oath, paralleling Christ's harrowing of hell. He heals the spiritually afflicted, people suffering from the black shadow, a demonic sickness no ordinary healer can touch, because, quote, the hands of the king are the hands of a healer. echoing Christ's healing ministry in the Gospels. He reunites divided kingdoms under one crown as Christ united Jew and Gentile, and at his coronation, Tolkien describes him as Ancient of Days, with a light about him, language pulled straight from the book of Daniel's description of God. The Fellowship departs on December 25th, and their mission concludes on March 25th, the Feast of Annunciation. The entire arc of The Lord of the Rings is framed by the Catholic liturgical calendar. None of this was accidental, and none of this is pagan. But we're not going to talk about all that. We're not going to get into the hyper specifics, because the reality is, if we're responding directly to someone like Jack Posobiec and the handful of TPUSA commentators who might have agreed with him, they're not interested. Posobiec is making that excruciatingly clear with how he's antagonizing people on social media about this, showing zero willingness to engage with the actual substance of any kind of counter-arguments. He is not reconsidering, and he's not curious. He is doubling down and dismissing anyone who disagrees, treating the debate as something he's already won by virtue of having said his piece loudly enough. That tells you everything you need to know about whether this is a man pursuing truth or a man defending a position. So no, this video and our discussion here is not an attempt to change his or any of their minds. This is for you and anyone else who might have heard his claim and felt something was off, but maybe didn't have the ammunition to articulate why. Which brings us to a point of meticulously attempting to define what overtly pagan actually means, or rather, what it doesn't mean. Because Posobiec didn't define it well enough on that podcast. He specifically said, quote, "I've heard people say Lord of the Rings is overtly Christian. And I hate to burst your bubble, guys, but you're just wrong. There's nothing overtly Christian about Lord of the Rings. There's no church in it, there's no faith in it, there's no Christ figure. There's none of these things. And honestly, Lord of the Rings, if it's anything, is overtly pagan." So the more we try to break this down, the sillier this discussion seems. We've already addressed that the bones of the story are built in Catholicism. Tolkien knowingly based characters and plot points on scripture. There are Christ-like figures, and none of them are perfect, specifically because they are not Christ. They are symbolic of Christ without being Christ himself. But the no church part, I'd like to explore that. I mean, we said before, Tolkien did that deliberately, but that doesn't mean there is no prayer, Jack. In the books, when the Nazgul attack at Weathertop, Frodo cries out, "O Elbarath, Gilthaniel," before striking at the Witch King, which, if we really render down what that means, it basically means, "Holy Mother, help me," mirroring the Catholic tradition of invoking the name or the Virgin Mary against demonic forces, which causes the Nazgul, in this case, physical pain. There are many cases where such divine intervention happens, mirrored against Catholic beliefs. But again, by discussing this, that's talking to the substance. Instead, I want to focus on what overtly pagan means and is implied to mean. Calling something overtly pagan in the way in which they have is to imply that the Lord of the Rings is spiritually compromised and Christians should distance themselves from it. That is the functional message, whether they say it outright or hedge around it. And that is an immediately slippery slope. If the standard for overtly pagan is that a story draws on pre-Christian mythological traditions, then you have just condemned the entire Western literary canon. Dante's Divine Comedy is saturated in Greco-Roman mythology. Virgil himself is the guide through hell. Milton's Paradise Lost leans on classical illusion as heavily as Tolkien leans on Norse. Beowulf, the poem Tolkien spent his academic career defending, is a story about a pagan warrior told by a Christian poet. Augustine built his theology on Neoplatonist philosophy. Aquinas baptized Aristotle. The Catholic Church strived to preserve pagan books, not burn them. They studied them, and then they built entire civilizations on them. Each day of the week is named after a Norse or Roman god. If overtly pagan means what Posobiec's usage implies, it means then you political commentators are implying that Catholicism and Christianity have been operating on a contaminated foundation for 2,000 years, which I refuse to allow. If you start saying There is a standard that something is not Christian enough. You are laying a trap for yourself and Christians to get hurt with. If you were to accept that a devout Catholic's life's work can be dismissed as pagan because it uses mythological furniture, you have created a purity test that nothing and no one can survive, because there is always another layer to strip away. And you will strip it away. It doesn't end. This is the slippery slope. There is always another element that someone with a platform and an uneducated, foolish opinion can flag as insufficiently orthodox. Today you attack Tolkien. Tomorrow it's C.S. Lewis, whose Narnia books are full of fauns and centaurs and a talking lion that is not technically Jesus because he's a lion and his name is Aslan and not Jesus. Goodnight Moon? Pagan. Green eggs and ham? Pagan. Christmas trees, used in celebration for the birth of Christ, aren't in the Bible. Do we need to burn those too, Jack? How about wedding rings? The wedding ring is a tradition that predates Christianity. The wedding ring itself is an Egyptian practice. Are we doing away with that next? The logical conclusion of overtly pagan as an undefined, weaponized label is a faith that is stripped away of every cultural artifact that has ever touched the pre-Christian or post-Christ world. Now, that should be enough right there. We should be done. A couple of dummies on the internet said that Tolkien's work is not Christian. There are plenty of folks with more facts and authority than some guy in a wizard outfit who can very easily disprove that claim, and credit to them for doing so. However, the whole discussion here and who the ones are that are speaking takes us beyond a bad take on a fantasy novel. Since the backlash started, Jack Posobiec has had every opportunity to do what any reasonable person does when they've overstepped on a subject they're not an expert in. And that doesn't mean they need to bow to the mob or apologize or break out the ukulele for some kind of apology video. I don't want that. He shouldn't have to do that. However, when you are one of the front-facing leaders of an organization that is currently sitting in a fragile marketing position, like TPUSA is, the correct thing to do after creating a controversy like this would be to temper the claim a little. You acknowledge the pushback and say something as easy as reasonable minds can differ. You do something that lowers the temperature without making yourself appear as if you're taking a knee. If that was the case here, I might not have done this video at all. He has not done any of that. Every response has been a version of, I'm right, you're wrong, and I don't care how much evidence you bring me. He has been presented with Tolkien's own letters, with the scholarly record, with the theological framework, and with the historical and literary context, and he has dismissed all of it. That's the behavior of a man who has decided that being seen as confidently correct is more important than actually being correct. And that distinction matters enormously, because a person who cannot absorb new information and adjust accordingly is a person who will make the same mistake on every subject every time with increasing confidence. This is Lord of the Rings we're talking about. This is fiction. The stakes here are cultural. They're not existential. And even with stakes this low on a topic this well documented, with evidence this accessible, he cannot bring himself to course correct. That should concern anyone who listens to him on subjects where the stakes are higher. Because the pattern you're watching play out over a Tolkien debate doesn't stay contained to one topic. A man who will burn credibility and goodwill to the ground rather than come to a middle ground when he's wrong about a novel is a man who will do the same thing when the subject is policy or faith or the future of a movement. This man is meant to be one of the front-facing leaders in a political organization that is already treading on fragile ground. This is a man who has tremendous power and a voice in our political system, who happens to spend time in the White House advising the president. And he's proven that his opinions, even when proven wrong, are immovable. That is so dangerous, it's scary. In my humble opinion. Quote, I don't care what he wrote in some letter. The stories themselves are overtly pagan, and the fact people like Colbert love them are obvious proof of this. Okay? So if Stephen Colbert, whom you both share polarizing political opinions with, likes Lord of the Rings, then that means it's pagan? Is that really where we're at? Also, Colbert, whether you like him or not, is a devout Catholic, much like yourself. Colbert drinks water, I'm pretty sure. Is water pagan on principle too? You know, last week I did a video discussing the overly satanic imagery and usage in Hollywood media. I got a lot of comments saying that what I was promoting was adjacent to satanic panic. That's not true. What I was speaking to is that Hollywood keeps putting the biblically Christian Satan and black magic demonology in movies and shows, but they hardly reference or include the sovereignty and power of Jesus Christ. If you're going to make stories about the Bible's demons, then Jesus and the invocation of his name defeats them, right? See, from a logical perspective, they are deliberately cutting source material to make their plots work for the big screen. That was my point. That, in and of itself, is not satanic panic. It is a challenging of an idea. What Jack Posobiec and the handful of TPUSA team that corroborate with these sentiments are doing is satanic panic. When I challenge Hollywood writers to include the full scope of biblical source material in their horror films, I am asking them to take Christianity more seriously, not less. That is an offensive position. That is confidence in the faith. For the overtly pagan claim, it's the opposite. They're telling Christians to retreat from a story that already contains the values they claim to be fighting for. That's a defensive posture rooted in either ignorance or panic, and neither one is useful to the people who follow him. And all of this, through this whole video, leads me to an obvious conclusion and a question that I wish I didn't have to ask, but my conscience won't quite let me leave it alone. Does Jack Posobiec and the TPUSA team think that their rhetoric saves souls? Because that is supposedly their mission. Wasn't that the other part of Charlie Kirk's philosophy in starting this company? Sure, freedom, free markets, and limited government is your core mission, but, quote, in everything we do, we aim to glorify Christ. Our mission is to equip the church to stand for biblical truth, combat cultural compromises, and inspire a return to foundational Christian values. That's the mission of TPUSA Faith. Do you think what you're doing is honoring that mission? Does telling millions of people that one of the most beloved, most morally serious, most virtue-saturated works of fiction ever written is overtly pagan and spiritually dangerous bring a single person closer to Jesus Christ? For instance, does it reach the young person who, perhaps, has never set foot in a church, but who read Tolkien and felt for the first time in their life that maybe good and evil are real, and that courage matters, and that the small and the humble can change the course of history? That kid might have been on the doorstep. That kid was closer to the gospel than they knew, and you just told him the story that brought him there was a pagan trap. Who does that serve? Who do you serve? Who walks into a church because Jack Posobiec or some TPUSA activist told them Tolkien was a pagan? Name the person. Describe the conversion process. Tell me the testimony that begins with, I came to Christ because a political commentator on Rumble told me the greatest Catholic author of the 20th century was actually working against God. This is foolish. And you're failing the very God you claim to champion for. Rhetoric like this does not evangelize. It does not disciple. It poisons people's minds against your cause. They don't see any goodness underneath. They see another arrogant talking head Christian telling me what to do, who to be, and how to think, just like every other bad guy on my television, without ever attempting to empathize with who they might be, where they come from, and why Christ matters. In Matthew 28:19 through 20, Jesus tells his disciples, "Go and make disciples of all nations." This is a command to move outward, to meet people where they are, to invite them in. The entire posture of the gospel is expansive. It's an invitation. Christ did not stand at the gates and tell people which stories they were allowed to love before. He would speak to them. He walked into their world and showed them something true inside the things they already knew. That is exactly what Tolkien did with Middle-earth. He showed people the virtues of Christ. He didn't bark at them like a dog. Whether it's Hollywood or writers or YouTubers or TikTok or political activists, there are people who want to change the stories where we find the purest forms of goodness and hijack them to make you bitter, my friends, to make you afraid, and to make you subservient to them and what they want you to think and feel. do not give them the satisfaction. We are living in a terrifying age. I will not pretend that it is anything other than unsettling, and many of you may wonder, why me? Why now? Why must I live through this particular age? And you may become bitter after looking into the atrocities that are happening in our world. You turn on the news, and all you see is the darkness of mankind, war and pain and starvation, murder, death. Every day you think, oh, it can't get much worse than yesterday, and surprise, it continues to get a little bit worse each day. Many would have you believe that their earthly bound method is the only way out, and that you need to follow them into battle. My friends, these are wolves in sheep's clothing. You need to think for yourself. There are many who wish they didn't have to live through terrible ages such as this, but I would challenge you in that to fight back. You do not get to decide what age of humanity you get to exist in. You are here now for a purpose. If you do not know what it is, ask yourself, who would you be if you could? What would you do if you stopped caring what the world thought of you? How much goodness could you offer to others if you first offered goodness to yourself? It is not for you to decide the time you get. All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you. Until next time, create, innovate, inspire others to do so as well, and for the love of God, cancel Disney+. Goodbye.